What's up, guys? I'm currently reading through the book of Luke, and when I'm reading the Bible, normally I highlight and write notes on whatever, like specific verses that I like, what God's kind of trying to say. And as I was reading through Luke 6, I finished it and I realized that I had highlighted almost every single verse in the book, and I kind of knew that I had to make a video on it. So, like in Luke 6, Jesus is preaching to a crowd, and he kind of says some things that are, like uncomfortable to hear. He says to love your enemies and not to judge, and to build your life on, what I say, not just what you believe. And they're not suggestions, they're not ideas for people who feel like doing it. Jesus says them like commands. And, like, I think that a lot of us have been following a version of Jesus that is, more comfortable than the one that Jesus describes in Luke 6. So Luke 6, verse 27, Jesus says, "But to you who are listening, I say, love your enemies, do good to those who hate you, bless those who curse you, pray for those that mistreat you." Okay, so Jesus says to love your enemies, not to tolerate them or ignore them or, avoid them or not say bad things about them. He's saying to love them, to do good things to them, to bless them, to, pray for them, to spread Jesus's love to them. And, most of us kind of struggle to be kind to the person who wrongs us or is annoying. But, Jesus is telling us to actively love the people that, who genuinely hurt us. And then he goes further. He says in Luke 32 to 33, Luke 6, 32 to 33, "If you love those who love you, what credit is that to you? Even sinners love those who love them. And if you do good to those who are good to you, what credit is that to you? Even sinners do that." So loving people who love you back is not just a Christian like distinctive. Everyone does that. Your enemies do that. That's just basic human nature. And what sets a follower of Jesus apart is what you do when it costs you something. When the person doesn't deserve it, when they haven't apologized, when they probably never will. So, loving your enemies, it doesn't mean, being like a doormat. It doesn't mean that you pretend that what they did was okay. It doesn't mean there's no boundaries. It just means that you are refusing to let what they did to you turn you into something that looks nothing like Jesus. So, next, Jesus says something a little bit different. In Luke 6:37, he says, "Do not judge, and you will not be judged. Do not condemn, and you will not be condemned. Forgive, and you will be forgiven." And, I think that this is very misunderstood, because people use "do not judge" to mean never call anything or anyone wrong. But that's not kind of what Jesus is trying to say. The word for judge in Greek is krino, and it means to condemn or to write someone off, or to like decide someone's worth and sentence in your mind. And Jesus is not saying that you can't recognize sin. He's saying that you have no business setting yourself up as the final word on another person's soul. And then Jesus gives us an image. In Luke 6:41 to 42, he says, "Why do you look at the speck of sawdust in your brother's eye and pay no attention to the plank in your own eye? How can you say to your brother, 'Brother, let me take the speck out of your eye,' when you yourself fail to see the plank in your own eye? You hypocrite. First take the plank out of your eye, and then you will see clearly to remove the speck from your brother's eye." It's in his description, he says a plank. It's not a splinter or a small piece of wood. It's a plank. It's like a 2x4. And Jesus is using that hyperbole to make a point that is impossible to miss. You are walking around with a plank sticking out of your eye, squinting at the speck in someone else's, and you think that you're qualified to operate on them. And the most judgmental people are almost always the people who are running from something in themselves. Judgment of others is often just, self-examination, that got aimed in the wrong direction. And, notice that Jesus doesn't say ignore the speck, but he says first take the plank out of your own eye. And then you'll see clearly to be able to actually help someone. And accountability and judgment are two different things. One comes from humility and love, and the other is just coming from pride. And only one of them actually looks like Jesus. And then Jesus closes his whole sermon with this. And when you understand what he's been saying the whole time, it hits different, because Luke 6:46-48 says, "Why do you call me Lord, Lord, and not do what I say? As for everyone who comes to me and hears my words and puts them into practice, I will show you what they are like. They are like a man building a house who dug down deep and laid the foundation on rock. When a flood came, the torrent struck that house but could not shake it because it was well built." It says, why do you call me Lord and not do what I say? That is like one of the most direct things that Jesus can say, and it's aimed squarely at people who consider themselves followers of him. He's not aiming it at atheists or people who have rejected God. It's people who call him Lord. And he says that the difference between a life that holds and a life that collapses is not what you believe, but it's what you do with what you believe. And the passages connect. Like love your enemies, that's a doing. Stop judging, that's a doing something. And build on the rock, that's doing. And real faith is not a feeling that you have on Sunday morning. It's not a label that you wear. It's not the worship music that makes you feel emotional. It's what you do on a Wednesday afternoon when someone wrongs you. How you react or what you do, and what you do when you see someone else's flaw and feel the pull to talk about it, and what you do when following Jesus costs something. And that storm comes for everybody, and Jesus doesn't promise his followers a storm-free life. He promises that if you build on him, actually obey and do the hard things, that you will not be shaken. And Luke 6:49 says, "But the one who hears my words and does not put them into practice is like a man who built a house on the ground without a foundation. The moment the torrent struck that house, it collapsed and its destruction was complete." Complete destruction. And a faith built on good intentions and Sunday attendance and calling Jesus Lord without actually following him is a faith that will not hold when that storm comes. And that storm will always come, and you're always going to go through hard things. So here's what I want to leave you with, and that Luke 6, it's not a list of rules, it's a description of what a life with Jesus should actually look like. And people can't see your theology. They can't see what you believe. They can't see how you treat the person that hurt you. They can see whether you're quick to judge, or they can see whether your life looks any different because of who you say you follow. So this week, think of a person that it's hardest to love right now, and just pray for them. Not a quick 2-second prayer, but ask God to bless them and ask God to work in their life. And that act is worth more than 100 of my YouTube videos talking about loving your enemies. So just do that thing and build your foundation, and that's what Luke 6 is asking of you. So I hope you guys have a good week. If you need anything, you can shoot me a text or leave a comment or whatever. But I hope you have a good day.